Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and by complete happenstance, we get to talk about the dawning of two new eras in tokusatsu in the same year, and, adding to the coincidences, both new eras begin on a foundation of technological innovations and their impact on the current world, complete with the potential as well as the drawbacks such advances naturally bring. Although, I strongly suspect that 01 will have slightly more to add to the discourse of a topic that will only continue to rise in relevance in the real world. Originally, I was going to maybe save an initial thoughts video on this new writer season for a bit later while I slave away on that Fourze script, but I felt like jumping in right now for the best possible reason. 01 looks interesting as hell and seems equally as promising premise-wise as well. So, with all that said, let's dig into the premiere and discuss further. So we kick things off with a bit of background on the Hidden Intelligence Company as well as this particular world, filled to the brim with Humagear AIs, so depending on what the show ultimately wants to say about artificial intelligence, we'll either end up with Detroit becoming human or iRobot, or maybe both, if the hint towards the history of this world is any indication, but I do predict that they'll likely commit fully to our MC's perspective of wanting to see AI as allies, despite losing his job to one, and in doing so, emphasize their capacity for humanity above all else, all while treating the fear of AI that naturally comes with literally any medium who deals with this specific topic as backwards thinking created from the scars of yesteryear. I do hope that it'll end up being a bit more nuanced than that, however, and whether or not this show ends up as that will likely depend on Hirobi and Jin and what ends up defining their motivations. But I think there's a bevy of interesting angles they can take with him and his terrorist organization, which I'm not going to try to pronounce because I screwed it up way too many times while recording. My prediction is that the series will look to place a magnifying glass on the true cost of AI, digging into how far humanity is willing to go to advance the world, perhaps at the cost of others, which would basically make Hirobi and Jin somewhat akin to Sensui from Yu Yu Hakusho, except with robots instead of demons. We'll see how potentially wildly inaccurate those postulations become in due course, but for right now, we gotta talk about the man at the center of it all. Aruto Hiden is a character that is immediately presented as an easy sell for me, because he's not just a comedian, oh no, he's a bad one, which means strap in guys, because he's gonna be delivering cringy one-liners, puns, and dad jokes until your eyes roll to the back of your head, and I am here for it. I don't know if we deserve a spiritual successor to Nosam, but I'd be very, very satisfied if that's what we end up with here. And the end gag of Izu explaining the joke after Aruto tells one is something I really hope becomes recurring. But even beyond that, I think the kid made a pretty good first impression overall. I like the fact that his first instinct when facing this season's robotic monsters is to try to do something to stop it, and then, failing that, he agrees to become a Kamen writer for the express purpose of gaining the power to make a positive difference. And the first episode made it clear that this specific motivation has always been inside of him. That's what drove him to become a comedian in the first place. But then, his new destiny becomes set once he realizes that there are in fact broader ways to generate the smiles and laughs he so desperately wanted to see and hear prior to the start of the season proper. It'll make things extra heartbreaking when Aruto is inevitably forced to realize down the road that being a writer won't always have a happy ending. We don't get much from Ames during this episode, but the tease for episode 2 stands to increase their involvement very quickly. But whether intentional or not, they already come off as the spiritual successors to Keiichiro and Tsukasa, right down to Yua trying to be reasonable, calm, and in control, while Isamu just shoots everything all the time. And it's a fairly fitting setup when you realize that this pair will likely also serve as hard counters and or unwilling allies to Aruto himself, and I rarely find that type of dynamic in toku shows unenjoyable. But we did get a bit more from the Hiden Company itself and the hopefully not obvious big bad in the making with the Vice President, because, we've already seen Iron Man. So I'm hoping that Mr. VP eventually develops into an ally while he begrudgingly helps Aruto figure out the business side of, well, running a business. Hard to say how far they'll actually go into that particular part of it, but it would be cool to see both Aruto's ambitions and missteps as president have tangible real-world impact, because for a company this big, this powerful, you can't really run it on the principles of laughs and smiles all the time. So if the VP isn't at the very least a foil for that, then I'd be forced to question why they even took the angle of Boss Baby in the first place. But all speculation at this point, of course. Speaking more aesthetically, this first episode both looks and feels really good. The soundscape is noticeably powerful here, with the score and overall musical flair doing well to build up the scenes. And questionable CGI aside, the action scenes have a lot of life and personality to them. But even with my currently limited knowledge of the writer franchise, even I would come into this show expecting at least that much. All in all, 01 had a pretty strong start, and unlike the painfully mediocre Ryu Soldier, I suspect that the ideas this show's put into motion now will ultimately have much more weight later. The first episode of any show is probably the most difficult one to make, because making a good first impression is an inherently difficult task, and will inevitably turn off some percentage of people from your larger story. And even then, everything that succeeds this will necessarily depend on how you establish things now. But I have cautious optimism about 01. A lot of how interesting it'll become will depend on how they tackle the details inherent to their premise. But the characters, they're shaping up to be an enjoyable bunch all on their own, which to me is just as important, and even more so if we get a few good arcs out of it. But I for one am glad that my first of at least 3 or so Kamen Rider videos, for now, ended up being very positive. And I know I joke about it a lot, but I do genuinely apologize for being so all over the place with my videos and video making schedule as of late. It's been a pretty tough ask trying to balance my new real-world responsibilities with finding both the time and motivation to tackle specific topics. But once I get a better handle on things, my upload consistency should fall back into normal parameters as well, because there is a lot of stuff I want to talk about, including several writer-specific topics that have caught my attention, such as the Inevitability of Omagio and Fourze, of course, and probably build down the line, but that's a thick season, so that might take a while. But until then, thanks for watching.